This is a delight to be in California today and talking about my recent book that is looking at the first known Chinese woman to come to America. Her life and the purpose of her trip to this country still reverberates today in many interesting ways. And so that's a really important issue that I like to reiterate because there are many things that resonate from history to the present day. So you might ask me, so why would I be compelled to work on this project? So as Chris mentioned, for nearly my entire scholarly career, I've been engaged in the study of Asian influence on American culture. But while completing my dissertation about 30 years ago or more, I came across a tiny little squib in a newspaper about Afong Moy as it related to some Chinese merchants I was researching. The article talked about her meeting Andrew Jackson in the White House, and I was hooked. So I wanted to know how she fared as she moved through America, how Americans responded to her, and many years later, I've sort of come up with answers to my questions. So I'd like you to think back 185 years to an American country where a Chinese person was almost completely unknown. And when very, very few Americans had ever met a Chinese person in the flesh. And since I'm in California today, it's good to remind you that in 1834, before the gold rush and before any Chinese people had any indication there was gold in these hills, before they would be tempted to come to seek it, no Chinese person, as far as I know of, was here in California in 1834. So how did this Chinese girl, variously known as Afong Moy, though I think probably that was a name given to her, get to New York City in 1834, and who was she? So it's important when you're a historian to kind of do some historical hypothesis. And though I spent time researching in southern China in the archives and many, many years researching her in the United States, unfortunately, no one in 1834 recorded her family history or her family origins, and her only name is on the American ship manifest in 1834. And that, that name is phonetically placed in the manifest, so it's a little hard even to think that that's a real name. So no one at the time thought her family background was important enough to record. In doing the research, I found that it was very likely that a terrible flood and famine in the southern part of China, which we know as then Canton and now as Guangzhou, would have affected trade and the activities in southern China. And this would have had an impact as well, coupled with the fact that two Western merchants were very interested in and very ambitious to bring her to the United States. Probably Afong Moy was the daughter of a Guangzhou Cantonese Chinese merchant or a Chinese comprador. And a comprador is a person who served as an intermediary in a Western household, providing household goods and intersecting with the Western merchant's household and the Chinese markets. So probably this family might have also suffered in this famine when flooding was so terrible that all the ports were closed and where there was just no food. The other part of understanding who she was is that Afong Moy had bound feet. But not all Chinese women had bound feet. Generally, the woman who had bound feet weren't required to work or stand daily on their feet. So likely she was a family member in the merchant family or in a comprador family, one that had small means enabling her to forfeit any financial gain from a woman who had bound feet. And she was Han Chinese. And we know that because the governing Manchus who took over China in 1644 did not allow their women to have bound feet. Then, too, the other way to figure out who she might be was that this family had to have a way to interact with Western merchants. So generally, Chinese people had very little interaction with those from the West. And the exceptions, as I mentioned, would have been a small Chinese merchant or a comprador, which would allow a merchant that opportunity to go, the Western merchant, to go to a Chinese person within a 12-acre radius around Canton, around Guangzhou. So it was illegal for Chinese people to leave China at the time. It was illegal to learn English. It was illegal for a Western woman to come to Guangzhou. And despite all these obstacles, somehow the American ship captain's wife, Augusta Aubert, was allowed into Guangzhou to accompany Afong Moy out of China. So all these irregularities really fascinated me. How was it possible, with all the illegalities that were being forfeited, could Afong Moy have gotten out? The question was, who pulled the strings and why? So likely, as I mentioned earlier, the really chaotic times, the famine and the floods in this Chinese city contributed to a lot of confusion and money, probably lots of it, turned the heads of Chinese officials who could have put a stop to her leaving. So who had the money? Likely this came from, as I mentioned, Western merchants, New York City merchants. They were cousins, Francis and Nathaniel Carnes. Their story, too, had a lot of very unusual parameters, which I became very fascinated about. The Carnes mercantile activity had uncanny similarities to today's China trade. In fact, it anticipated the China trade activities of the early 21st century by more than 185 years. So in my research, I found both very interesting information about Afong Moy, but equally fascinating information about the early China trade that at this point no one in our scholarly experience had knowledge of. So in 1811, Nathaniel Carnes went to China as a young merchant on his father's boat, and his cousin moved to Paris, France. In the early 1800s, about 1830s, they worked together to develop a very unique and unusual marketing and business plan. First, they were going to bring to America large quantities of Chinese-produced goods that were imitative of Western goods and Western condiments to sell in America at much cheaper prices than other Western-made goods. So the Carnes merchants operated a bit like our Walmart today. So they imported goods like Walmart does, or whether Walmart's able to import goods now with tariffs, I'm not sure. It comes back and forth. We don't know. But they really developed this trade with a huge market of Chinese goods, recognizing that these small goods could be cheaply mass-produced in China and would find a big market in America where the middle-class people really had money now in their pockets. And they could do this because Francis Carne was in Paris. So what he did was to look around, survey what people were using, and sent fashionable European prototypes to China. There he had them reproduced, shipped to the US, and sold them in America at rock bottom prices. Now this is 185 years ago. This included French perfumes, sauces, syrups, fans, lots of fancy objects. Interestingly enough, I found that not only were the goods reproduced, but all the labels were reproduced too. So you had a Chinese perfume that was replicated from France with a label that said French perfume. So secondly, the Carnes would heavily invest in very inexpensive native Chinese goods that they hoped would be of great interest in America. These were generally, again, small objects, moderately priced, and had exotic appeal. Some of these objects were familiar to Americans in urban markets, but even this populace might not know what these objects were. They imported spectacular fireworks, ones that Americans had never seen before. Unusual collapsible lanterns, Chinese puzzles, Chinese toys, rice paintings, and pharmaceuticals such as Chinese rhubarb. But here's where Afong Moy comes into the picture. They promoted these goods, thousands upon thousands of these goods, in a really unusual and extraordinary manner by bringing attention to this cargo with Afong Moy who hawked their goods. So she would give them instruction about what these goods were, how to use them, how they were used in China, and in that process also talk about life in China. And she did this really kind of as a branding image, not unlike, the Chiquita banana lady who tells you where bananas come from. You get the message because you see what she looks like. That's the way Afong Moy would have been serving as a brander for the Carnes merchandise. Afong Moy spoke very little English. She was unschooled in written Chinese. She left no written record of her life in America or in China. And really what very little we know of her comes from newspaper accounts, from letters and diaries by Americans who met her, some poems written about her, and descriptions of her emotional response, what psychologists call affect, as she faced both welcoming and hostile audiences, facing audiences really of thousands across the United States and Cuba. So this paucity of records regarding Afong Moy for some time really disheartened my efforts. Historian Jill Lepore, considering her biographical work of Jane Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's sister, in her Book of Ages remarked, in writing this book about Benjamin Franklin's sister, I had to stare down a truism. The lives of the obscure make good fiction, but bad history. And Jill Lepore had a whole lot more information about Benjamin Franklin's sister than I had on Afong Moy. So I wondered whether it might be just easier to fictionalize this account, taking some liberties since I had so little information. If that made more sense, it certainly would have taken a whole lot less time. Afong Moy's life as a traveler, as a hawker of Chinese goods, and herself an object of exotic interest, led her from 1834 to 1837 to cities and small towns in America. And I'm going to list where she was presented because it's pretty amazing. Remember, on bound foot. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Maryland, South Carolina, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Havana, Cuba, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Ohio, covering the eastern seaboard and beyond. In most of these places, with help of a Chinese interpreter named Atong, a man we even know much less about, she relayed what life was like in China. By the end of 1835, she had nearly rock star status. Almost everyone had heard of this story of the Chinese women with bound foot through newspaper accounts and, interestingly enough, a lot by word of mouth. And many saw this lithograph you're seeing here that was produced in magazines and in papers. Here, what you're seeing is a view of Afong Moy in her New York salon in 1834-35 by artists Charles Rizzo and William Brown. Note the interesting objects surrounding her. This looks like a warehouse of goods, but all kinds of things, some of which would have come in the Cairns ships. In developing the story of Afong Moy, it was important for me to place her in the America of this time. So there are many forces at work in this period of the New Republic, 50 years after the American Revolution. Americans were establishing who they were, what their democracy would be like, and how they might work together. Afong Moy's treatment and the issues she faced are really reflective of this period. And some, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, are really reflective of today's challenges as a nation. So the remainder of the talk, I'm going to focus specifically on the issues that Afong Moy faced as she made her way through America. But just to be clear, the book is much broader in scope. It looks at the way Afong Moy affected American life at the time. It looks at foodways, use of Chinese objects in the home, hairstyles, and so much more. And the book also addresses how and what Afong Moy was able to share about China, and also how Americans responded to her commentary. So moving across America in these middle years of the 1830s, Afong Moy confronted several issues. That of slavery, nativism, moral reformers, hostility toward Native Americans and Native American removal, anti-slavery activists, treatment of the poor, and surely anti-immigrant resentment. So we know of the trials that she had through others' accounts in their diaries, as I mentioned earlier, in letters, in poems, and in newspaper reports throughout this time. Now, Afong Moy was not enslaved, but she was also not free. She had likely little choice about leaving China. And I think I might have mentioned that she was young, 16 or perhaps at the oldest 19. Very young, very malleable. So leaving China and having a new position in America was restricted, and it was really circumscribed by her managers and those who brought her. Her condition, of course, was very different from the enslaved that she encountered as she moved south. And yet, interestingly enough, there were elements of her experience that paralleled those that she saw in Charleston, South Carolina. When she arrived in South Carolina, in Charleston, her manager, now Henry Hannington, and the book goes into how I figured out who that particular person was, helped by Google, I have to say, required her to unbind her feet to be investigated first by 8 Charleston physicians. And they were to confirm the size of her foot, since people thought this was just remarkable, it was only 4 inches, And then the information about this investigation was going to be published in newspapers. And of course, the intent was to get attention and to attract an audience. Unwrapping, undressing your foot, your bound foot, in the company of strange men would have been absolutely unthinkable in China. The bound foot was the most private and erotic part of a Chinese woman's body, and it was kept hidden even to those people who were most intimate. Most unfortunately, in Charleston, not only did the physicians measure her feet in private, but shamefully, her manager, Henry Hannington, forced Afong Moy to unbind her feet in public. Here is the newspaper piece announcing the public's opportunity to view her unbound feet. Her response to this can be seen in the notice in the Charleston Courier. And you see that it says, it's with great reluctance we understand that she's consented to this, believing as she does that it is compromising her sense of delicacy. Had she been able to read English, she would have found a broadside posted in the Slave Mart in Charleston equally frightening. Descriptions fit her person pretty exactly. One posted in the Potter's Mart in Charleston advertised a likely yellow girl, 16 or 17 years old, sold for no fault, sound as $1. But let's be clear. Those in the North did not treat Afong Moy well either. Though some newspapers and diary accounts recorded what audiences learned from Afong Moy about China in her salons, the Bostonian press was particularly nasty. The Boston Evening Transcript presented the Chinese lady as, quote, a homely Indian squaw with her feet cut off and her ankles stuck into a couple of turnips. They elaborated by noting that our Indian squaws, referring to Afong Moy and a Cleopatra figure modeled on a Potawatomi Indian, are becoming classic property with skin of half-baked brick and smoked salmon. Like Afong Moy, American Indians were the subject of public presentations in the 1830s stage. So after the defeat of Black Hawk, and the defeat was by the American troops in 1832, President Andrew Jackson required Black Hawk and his fellow warriors to go on stage. They were going to be going on a public tour as prisoners of war. They were displayed on the stage as sort of exoticized trophies, but Black Hawk, unlike Afong Moy, was pretty strongly resistant, and he made his resistance very public. Afong Moy, without facility in English, couldn't do that. But less than a year later, Afong Moy was a passenger on the New Orleans steamboat South Alabama, likely along with removed Indians, because I found in research that South Alabama was the steamboat used to take Indians from Mobile, Alabama, and Florida. So when removal began in 1836, thousands of Indians were sent by steamboat to New Orleans, where they were housed in U.S. Army tents, and then were shipped up the Mississippi River and on to Fort Gibson and the West. So sharing this vessel with angry, displaced, disgruntled Indians would have been really uncomfortable for most passengers, but for one who somewhat looked similar to the displaced, it must have been really frightening. So some audience members who approached Afong Moy were really, well-intentioned, but their approach was aggressive and off-putting. So after Afong Moy engages with slavery in the South and issues of race, She now gets the full effect of the moral reform in the North. Both slavery and moral reform conveyed powerful emotional messages that she really couldn't ignore. Both issues spoke to her condition as slavery, to her race, and in religious culture, to her supposed heathenism. Interestingly enough, it was at the American Museum in New York City that moral reformers found Afong Moy. The audience included Margaret Pryor and Phoebe and John McDowell, who were at that time the principal moral reformers in New York City and in the nation. While Afong Moy was presenting about China and associated objects, Margaret Pryor rushed her on the stage. According to Phoebe McDowell, Pryor addressed her right there on the subject of her eternal salvation. Phoebe said, this is what she recounted in her book, so affecting was her appeal, that is Mrs. Pryor's appeal, that tears flowed profusely from the eyes of the interesting girl, while Mrs. Pryor conversed with her, saying she hoped her visit to this country would prove an invaluable blessing to her soul. Clearly, Afong Moy was affected, surprised, and probably frightened by Pryor's words. Surely Pryor was out of line to rush her on the stage, disrupt the presentation, and confront her publicly on such a private issue in front of hundreds, maybe thousands, causing her really visible anxiety. But I think it's important to explain the result and the background of this affront. During this time in America, there was a great transformation taking place. The changes in the commercial economy that the Carnes cousins were bringing forward disrupted traditional family values and relationships that had been in place in America for centuries. This was exacerbated by a wave of immigration, and people were adjusting to new ways of life. These changes led to many social ills, unemployment, poverty, inadequate housing, prostitution, disease. Not surprisingly, it was also a time, and this happens a fair amount when this disruption occurs, there was a lot of religious fervor. So moral reformers, many of whom were really spiritually minded women, found their calling at this point. They were attempting to combat these evils and what they saw as increasing moral disintegration of society. But culpability for these unrepentant neighbors, and I'm saying neighbors, and this is neighbors both immediately around them, and also they are considering neighbors, those in China, they felt that their culpability rested on their shoulders, and it would equally determine their salvation. So it's likely why Pryor, whose soul was on the line as well, since if she didn't convert Afong Moy, her soul would be in dispute. This is why she was so impassioned and determined to save Afong Moy. Later in 1836, and I mentioned, sort of going back and forth on this timeline, but in 1836, I mentioned that Afong Moy went to New Orleans. But when she went to New Orleans, there was a little confusion about where to find her. A New Orleans broadside, the one you see here, functioning kind of like a poster. It would have been tacked up in store windows and on street lamps. It announced where she would be, and it's a little hard for you to see that, but it says that she would be in the North American Hotel, which is located actually in the old French Quarter. But all the newspaper accounts recorded her as being at the Camp Street Theater in the American section of New Orleans. So if she were coming in 1835, this would not have been a problem at all. It wouldn't have mattered where she performed. But by 1836, Nativist tensions in New Orleans were really high. In the 1830s, those who advocated for tighter immigration, stricter voting rights, and were alarmed at the possible influence of immigrant cultures and religions were termed nativists. Does that sound familiar to you today? In 1835, New Orleans person John Gibson established a very strong nativist organization because he wanted to counter the Louisiana governor's placement of non-native naturalized New Orleanders who were also Catholic in government positions. John Gibson's principal supporter was the owner, interestingly enough, of the Camp Street Theater in the American part of town. The Camp Street Theater was the first English-speaking theater in New Orleans. It held 1,000 people, and interestingly enough, too, it was the first theater in the United States to be lit by gas. But he really crushed the French Street Theater's business. And this was really felt by those in the French Quarter. Afong Moy was caught in a tug of war between the two factions, the nativists and the French Creoles. Ultimately, the nativists won. It might have seemed to you a bit paradoxical that Afong Moy was welcomed into a theater owned by a nativist, someone who didn't want her in the United States, and she was a sojourner, an immigrant. Why would he fight to have a Chinese person in a nativist theater? However, if you look at that broadside, you'll see that her presentation was seen as a curiosity, a curious moment, not as advocacy for early multiculturalism, nor an advocacy or acceptance of the Chinese in America. Because this was a national tour, it was organized by Americans, the Americans in New Orleans should have the first chance to see her perform in an American theater. So leaving New Orleans, Afong Moy moves up the Mississippi River. And she's moving up the river by steamboat. She visits towns and cities along the way. And eventually they turn east on the Ohio River to stop at Cincinnati, Ohio. So Cincinnati was a free state, as you may know, but the city and where it was bordered Kentucky, which was a slave state. As a result, African Americans naturally would go across the border from Kentucky to Cincinnati in Ohio, where they could find work. And they were competing for jobs held previously by whites. Just before Afong Moy arrived, mobs had turned on the Black community there, burned their homes, attacked and killed those Blacks that were considered infringing on their employment opportunities. This very condition, this very friction, this close proximity to the southern border and riotous behavior attracted Northern abolitionists because they could use Cincinnati as a place to begin to approach slaveholders in the South. And the abolitionist-leaning Stowe family, Harriet Beecher Stowe, one of them, was actually in Cincinnati when Afong Moy was there. However, the problem is that she was 6 months pregnant with twins. And so it's unlikely, and I haven't found any record of Harriet Beecher Stowe at the time coming to see Afong Moy in Cincinnati. But in her circle of friends was a like-minded abolitionist called Reverend William B. Tappan. So it was here in Cincinnati that Tappan saw Afong Moy on stage. He recorded it and talked about it, and then penned a poem called The Chinese Lady and another poem called Books for China. This portrait of him was by a Philadelphian, John Sartain, and it was completed in 1836, the year that he published his poem on Afong Moy. So he published the poem fairly soon after he saw her. In the poems, he used the language of the abolitionists to expand on the larger concept of Afong Moy's enslavement, but this time enslavement in her religious convictions, in her heathen orthodoxy, that he said bound Chinese people to superstitious beliefs. So it's unclear whether he, like Margaret Pryor in New York, was proselytizing Afong Moy, but it's very likely that he did. So all this time that we're hearing about Afong Moy on the road, money's being made for the Carnes. And surely it was rolling in because people began to hear of their goods through Afong Moy and through merchants who were advertising in newspapers when she arrived in these various cities. And the Carnes convinced other China trade merchants to go in with them on sending vessels to China and bringing back what became a very, very lucrative commercial business. However, their market was short-lived. The first calamity that they encountered was absolutely their own mistake. According to a contemporary account, the Carnes brought in so many goods, thousands upon thousands of fireworks, lanterns, rhubarb, little vials of perfume, so much of this stuff that the market collapsed, smothered under their huge volume of their own goods that were being brought in, and there wasn't enough public to buy all this stuff. So the next problem was their own, not their own making. An enormous fire in New York City burned their warehouses to the ground. And if that wasn't enough, in 1837, a huge depression engulfed the entire nation, and this completely finished them off. So the question is, and I posed it, how did this affect Afong Moy? So now we know that very few people could affect these Chinese, could afford to buy these Chinese goods because we were in a depression. Many fewer had extra pennies to go see her on stage. So what happens to her? With all these travels, Afong Moy really had no community. She had no home. Her itinerant life really didn't afford her any place of refuge. So, yeah, but you might have expected help to come from somewhere, perhaps from the Carnes, who had profited a lot from her, or maybe the ship captain, Aubert, or his wife, Augusta, who accompanied her on her trip from China to the US, or maybe her manager, Hannington, or maybe Hannington's wife, Catherine, who helped teach her English, but actually no one stepped forward to assist her. So this record of her life up till this point, and probably her life itself, might have ended with the tragedy and the panic of 1837, had it not been for a few citizens of Monmouth, New Jersey. The Monmouth Inquirer published an account in 1838 based on investigative work of several people who found Afong Moy in the far reaches of Monmouth County, New Jersey. According to another newspaper, she arrived there, quote, because the profits of her manager began to decrease, and she was finally shamelessly abandoned in a Monmouth County in the state in a helpless situation. She was provided for by the authorities of that county in a poorhouse. Here's where she remains when a company of persons redeemed her by defraying the expenses of her maintenance. So how does this work in 1838 America? How do the poor manage? So American poor, deemed deserving of community support by freeholders of the country, would find refuge in poorhouses. But in a poorhouse, you had to prominently display that you were poor with a badge on your shoulder that's a big P, poor. In 1838, the Monmouth Inquirer became the headquarters for news of this abandoned woman, of the abandoned Afong Moy. They disseminated information and updates to newspapers around the country from Louisiana to New Hampshire. The national newspapers demanded to know who had treated such an international guest in such a deplorable and despicable way, and insisted in the paper that full right has to be done to the stranger Chinese. Interestingly enough, they were so persistent that they did flush out the probable culprit. And you can probably figure out who that is. So it was her manager, Hannington, and the inquiry forced him to provide additional support while she was in the poorhouse. But that Americans came to her defense at this time, I think can be seen as very encouraging. So you might expect, okay, so Afong Moy is now in New Jersey, she's in a poorhouse, this is the end of her. But it didn't end there. She spent 8 years in the poorhouse in New Jersey, yet public interest in China and in Chinese objects reemerged in the late 1840s with the arrival in the New York harbor of a Chinese junk, a specialized Chinese ship, with a Chinese crew and historical Chinese objects. In a convoluted way, which the book details, P.T. Barnum was made aware of Afong Moy in New Jersey. As P.T. Barnum was, and we know him to be, a marketer of difference, a promoter of preposterous falsehoods, and an incorrigible exaggerator, Barnum paired Afong Moy with another one of his showstoppers, Charles Stratton, aka Tom Thumb. Barnum published a pamphlet advertising his two phenoms, with Afong Moy's write-up much more extensive than Tom Thumb's. It's about 7 pages, actually, about Afong Moy, and only a page about Tom Thumb. Everybody knew who Tom Thumb was. Their performance together was a sensation. One of the episodes apparently staged Afong Moy eating with chopsticks, with Tom Thumb trying to do the same, and probably everybody thought it was pretty hilarious. Yet ultimately, it provided Afong Moy with no greater future security than had her previous experience. The story of Afong Moy began as ended, shrouded in the inconclusive and in the indefinite, a search for her name and variations of her name in census records and newspapers and Barnum's accounts and poorhouses in New Jersey and New York yielded nothing. Yet, in mid-19th century America, the life of an Asian and of a woman, even when the woman lived such an extraordinary life, was destined to obscurity. Jared Sparks, the 19th century's most prestigious historian, aimed to record a history of America based on original documents. He explained his position. Sometimes the historian fails on account of his subject. At other times, for the want of materials. It is not in the power of the greatest mind to make that dignified and interesting, which in its nature is low and unattractive. So, he concluded, it is best to choose a subject that will not waste his time in developing or recording events that have, as he said, nothing in them to command admiration or awaken the sympathy of mankind. Therefore, Sparks encouraged historians to bring together a series of facts which should do justice to the fame and character of a man who possessed qualities and performed deeds that rendered him remarkable and are worthy of being remembered. Why, he asked, should historians write accounts of men and women who during their existence produced no impression on the public mind? Why, he asked, would the world be called off from its busy occupations to listen to an ill-told story of little concern? But Afong Moy's story is powerful precisely because it's unrecorded, because it conveys early 19th century issues and attitudes that should awaken the sympathy of mankind. It should alert us to historical issues in their present manifestation, and it should command admiration for a resolute Chinese woman who traveled the country as a sojourner in a time when no other person did the same. To be sure, her life here marks the beginning of a larger story of the China trade and the U.S.-China relations, and also the mass marketing of Chinese goods in America. The goods she promoted in the 1830s remained long after she left the stage, And by the 1840s, it's estimated that in urban areas of the East Coast, more than 10% of all household goods in middle-class homes were from China. Fast forward to the 21st century, at a conservative estimate, 13% of all articles on Walmart shelves were labeled made in China. Often these goods were conceived, designed, manufactured, and shipped much the same way they were 185 years earlier. So thank you very much for sharing your time. And I hope that you don't feel like I'm taking your busy moments of occupation and talking about something that is of no concern. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating period of history. Throughout your talk, you mentioned some similarities you saw in that period and today. I would love to hear more. What are some of the common threads or instances when history tends to repeat itself?
That's a good point. I mentioned the issues of nativism, which is the concern about those who are not like us, those people who are coming from a different place. And there's a concern about whether they should vote, whether they should have the right to citizenship, whether they should be able to be part of our American experiment. And that is very precisely what was going on at the time with the nativist movement. The fights were real and ugly and disastrous. People got killed. We hope that's not going to happen here, but you have seen some evidence of what that means. And it was what was going on in the 1830s as well. So that's one example, that nativist thread that was happening then and is something that we see exacerbated today in the very aspect of issues of voting rights and who can be part of our American experience. Yes.
So for those watching who are curious and want to get into the world of writing and authoring, I know this is specifically a biography. What advice can you give to those who are looking into starting a biography of their own?
Starting a biography of their own?
Yeah.
Well, if you wanted to do a biography of your own, it would be a very good idea to jot down in a diary some of your thoughts day by day, some of the ways that you are thinking about your current time, the ways in which you have confronted some of the things that you've seen. I love this one little instance. I was talking to a person at my museum, and she said, you know, I went back to my diary of 1962 when I was only 11. And when I was 11, I went to Richmond, and I was standing next to a food counter at a local department store. And all of a sudden, these policemen rushed. She's writing this as a 11 or 12-year-old. She's writing about policemen coming in and closing down the department store. And then she talks about in her diary, kids coming in, white kids coming in, waving the American flag, and Black people sitting alone at the counter. But she wrote it in her diary, and she just brought it to me last week. And I thought, wow, isn't that great that as an 11-year-old, she's writing these things down in her diary. We hope we'll be able to use that actually in an exhibition in the next year or two. But that's the kind of thing that you should do if you are interested in recording your life. Make note of what you see around you.
You mentioned the Depression of 1837. I never learned that in my high school American history class, and you probably didn't either. So could you please tell us what was the cause of that and how long it lasted?
Sure. It was caused, we think generally, by the issue of paying for land debts. And Andrew Jackson wanted to hold American banks at bay, particularly the National Bank at bay. And he required that every land transaction be paid in cash. People didn't have that, and the banks couldn't fulfill that obligation. And so the banks began to fail. And food began to not be provided because farmers were not able to get paid for their food. I spent a lot of time in the book with a man named Philip Hone, who is in New York and is a diarist. Good point. A diarist who locates every single thing going on. He talks about the Depression of 1837 as horrific. He says, I think this depression is going to finish off America. And in fact, the Depression lasted a long time, probably 5 years or more. And it totally wiped out most of the New York merchants. And it had reverberations worldwide because it also knocked out their factors in London. So it was a huge deal. And 1837 Depression is really one of the pivotal, challenging moments in American economic history.
Thank you, Nancy, for being here.
Good, thank you.